The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped wasps, and Rachel Torres moved through Seattle General's cardiology unit with the kind of deliberate invisibility that comes from 3 months of being overlooked. The antiseptic smell was sharp in the air, that particular blend of bleach and human suffering that every hospital wore like a uniform. Her scrubs were plain navy, her badge hanging at chest level, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that revealed nothing except the faint scar along her left temple, barely visible unless someone knew to look for it. She did not look like someone who had held 17 lives together in a forward operating base during a mass casualty event. She looked like what she was supposed to look like, just a nurse. The kind hospitals hired when they needed bodies and weren't particular about credentials. Room for 07 held Colonel James Hendricks, blind veteran, Bagram survivor, recovering from what the charts called post-traumatic cardiac complications and what Rachel knew meant something far more deliberate. His eyes were wrapped in gauze, his left hand trembled slightly when he reached for water, and his blood pressure spiked every time a new medication was introduced to his full line. 3 other Bagram survivors had died the same way over the past 18 months, subtle symptom progression, dismissed as normal post-blast complications, then cardiac arrest before anyone connected the pattern. The Pentagon had sent Rachel in quietly, embedded her as a temp through a staffing agency, told her to watch and document and report nothing to hospital administration. Not yet. She knocked before entering, a courtesy that most staff skipped. "Morning, Colonel. How was the night?" His head turned toward her voice, a trained response even though his damaged optic nerves couldn't process the movement. "Torres." His voice was rough as gravel, a man who'd spent months in recovery wards learning to live in darkness. "You're the only one who asks like you actually want the answer." Rachel moved to his bedside and began the vitals check, a ritual she'd performed 4,732 times since leaving active duty, though she never counted anymore. Her fingers found his radial pulse automatically, steady beneath his skin, warm and alive. She was trained to find the difference between what people said and what their bodies revealed. Colonel Hendricks was afraid of something, and his pulse betrayed him at exactly 102 beats per minute. Elevated. Sustained. Not the anxiety of a recovering patient, the panic of a man who knew something was wrong and couldn't see it coming. "Night was quiet," he said. "Same dreams." "Sanjin?" His jaw tightened. "How did you?" "Lucky guess." She moved the blood pressure cuff onto his arm with practiced efficiency, the Velcro strap snapping into place with a sound like a salute. "I have relatives in the valley." It was a lie that felt true, a cover story embedded so deeply she could recite it backward. The truth was worse, she'd served under his command at the forward surgical team in Loga province, though he'd never known her face. Call signs didn't come with ranks or personal details. Call signs were armor. The cuff inflated, squeezing his arm with mechanical precision. Numbers climbed, 145/92. High. Consistent with the pattern she documented. Elevated cortisol, elevated catecholamines, the physical signature of chronic threat exposure, or poisoning. The distinction mattered. "You need to rest more," Rachel said, logging the reading on the chart with a pen that moved across the paper like she was transcribing someone else's life. That was the job. Document. Observe. Don't interfere until you have proof. Try to get back to sleep after breakfast. "Sleep's where they get you," Hendricks said quietly, and Rachel's hand paused for exactly one breath before continuing her work. Before she could respond, the cardiology rounds began their daily procession through the unit. Dr. Leonard Pierce entered first, his white coat pressed with military precision, his shoes polished to a shine that reflected the overhead lights. He was followed by the attending physician, 2 residents, a medical student, and a rotating cast of nurses who understood their position in the hierarchy without needing it explained. Behind them came the ritual of superiority, clipboards held at chest level, eyes forward, voices careful. This was how hospitals arranged themselves, the doctors at the apex, the nurses as functional equipment, and people like Rachel somewhere beneath that, not quite visible enough to matter. Dr. Pierce was a man whose power derived entirely from his ability to make other people feel small. Rachel had encountered his type in the military, officers who confused precision with competence, who mistook condescension for authority, who built walls instead of bridges and called it leadership. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of jawline that could cut glass if glass could feel the force of human arrogance. His voice had the particular cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, each word articulated as if he were speaking to people slower than himself. He stopped at room 407 and reviewed Hendricks' chart without looking at the patient. Still spiking fevers. No fever since yesterday morning, the resident offered. Vitals relatively stable. Relatively. Pierce's tone suggested that relative stability was a failure of precision. He glanced at Rachel for the first time, his eyes moving across her the way a laser moves across a wall, registering her presence without assigning her meaning. The temp nurse. You logged these vitals. I did. Rachel's voice was quiet, deferential, the voice of someone who understood her position. Every 2 hours per protocol. Pierce flipped through several pages of documentation, his jaw working slightly. These readings. Have you been trained on proper cuff placement? The technique matters. Sloppy methodology produces false data. Rachel had placed blood pressure cuffs 8,419 times since completing her field medicine certification. She had learned technique from combat medics who practiced under fire, who saved lives with equipment held together by duct tape and prayer. But she said nothing. She took one measured breath and waited for the rest. 3 months and still no permanent credential file. Pierce continued, addressing his words to his residents as though Rachel were not present. This is why we need to be cautious about temporary staffing. Anyone can apply. Not everyone meets our standards. He snapped Hendricks' chart closed without making eye contact with the patient himself. Continue current treatment protocol. I'll review the labs this afternoon. The rounds moved onward, a current of white coats and clipboards flowing toward room 408, and Rachel stood motionless at Hendricks' bedside until the sound of their voices faded into the fluorescent hum. The only thing that moved was her right hand, which rose unconsciously to the inside of her jacket pocket, where a faded patch of fabric lay sewn into the lining. It was small, barely 2 inches across, embroidered with a call sign and a unit designation in thread that had been carefully UN-threaded by time and washing until the letters were barely legible. But she could read them. She had read them in forward operating bases and recovery wards and at night when her own son was asleep in his bedroom 347 miles away. Reaper 6. That was who she'd been. That was not who she was supposed to be now. He hates you, Hendricks said quietly. Excuse me. Pierce. I can't see his face, but I know that voice. That's a man who feels threatened. You did something that made him feel small, and he'll spend the rest of his day building a case against you. That's how men like him operate. Rachel pulled up the chair beside his bed, a violation of protocol that would have earned her a note on her file if anyone had been watching. But no one watched temp nurses that closely, not yet. What makes you think he's threatened by me? Hendricks turned his head toward her voice with surprising accuracy. Because you're competent, and he can't stand competence he didn't hire. Also because I've served under officers like him for 23 years, and I know the smell of insecurity when it walks into a room. He's going to make your life difficult, Torres. I'm going to warn you about that right now, because I can hear it in his footsteps. He's already planning something. Rachel said nothing. She had already heard the slight escalation in Pierce's tone, already catalogued his body language, already understood that he viewed her as either beneath his notice or a threat to his hierarchy. There was rarely a middle ground with men who arranged the world into winners and losers. But she was trained to move through systems, to be invisible when necessary, to document what mattered and discard what didn't. Dr. Pierce was a variable in an equation that had nothing to do with cardiology and everything to do with whether Colonel James Hendricks would survive the next 3 months. He's just protective of his unit, Rachel said. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It is, Hendricks said, when protection becomes punishment. The morning moved forward in the manner of hospital mornings, medication carts rolling past, alarms beeping for patients who had learned to ignore them, fluorescent light pressing down on everyone like a physical force. Rachel moved through the cardiology unit, checking on her assigned patients, charting vitals, changing fours, performing the invisible labor that kept hospitals running. She was precise in her technique, efficient in her movements, unremarkable in every visible way. No one noticed that her hands were scarred along the knuckles, the result of 3 tours in places where helicopters landed in dust clouds and surgeons worked by the light of chemical glow sticks. No one noticed that she moved with a kind of controlled grace that came from training, that she positioned herself in corners where she could see both exits and entrances, that her eyes tracked the rhythm of the unit like a musician counting time. At 3 o'clock, she took her break in the supply closet, a narrow space between boxes of gauze and stacked bottles of saline solution. It was the only place in the hospital where she was truly alone. She pulled her jacket from the locker and felt the weight of it, then found the patch sewn into the lining. It was rough under her fingertips, the fabric stiffened by age and countless washings. She had sewn it there herself 6 months after leaving active duty, a private act of remembrance that violated more regulations than she could count. Wearing unit insignia off-duty, maintaining unauthorized mementos, carrying classified call signs in physical form, all of it was against regulations. All of it was necessary. She tucked it back inside and buttoned her jacket carefully, her hand steady as surgical instruments. What she did not know was that Dr. Pierce had already made 3 phone calls. What she did not know was that he had begun building his case against her incompetence, that he had spoken to the hospital's staffing coordinator about the difficulty of working with temporary nurses of unknown training, that he had requested, in a tone of professional concern, that someone review her qualifications more carefully. He hadn't done it out of medical concern. He had done it out of fear, the particular fear of men who sense that someone is not what they appear to be, who feel a kind of instinctive discomfort in the presence of competence they cannot categorize. He could not place her. He could not file her into his hierarchy. And that made her dangerous in the way that invisible things are always dangerous, unpredictable, uncontrolled, threatening to the order he had spent his entire career constructing. By the time Rachel clocked out at 7 p.m., Dr. Pierce had already begun the first stage of what would become a systematic campaign. By the time she drove home through streets lined with oak trees that hadn't changed in 200 years, he was composing an email to the nursing director, expressing concerns about quality control. By the time she pulled into her driveway and saw her 14-year-old son through the kitchen window doing homework at the table, Dr. Pierce was standing in his office at Seattle General, staring at her temp file and wondering what it was about Rachel Torres that made every instinct he possessed tell him to be afraid. He just didn't understand why yet. Dr. Pierce was standing in his office at Seattle General, staring at her temp file and wondering what it was about Rachel Torres that made every instinct he possessed tell him to be afraid. He just didn't understand why yet. The file was thin, 3 months of employment, unmarked competence, 0 disciplinary history. That was the problem. No one was that clean. No one went 3 months in a major hospital without stepping on someone's toes, without making mistakes, without giving him something to work with. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began to write. The next morning, Pierce arrived for rounds at 6:22 a.m. carrying his leather-bound patient portfolio and his certainty. He moved through Seattle General like a man accustomed to air parting for him, shoulders back, chin elevated, the kind of posture that comes from decades of believing your credentials make you untouchable. He had 42 years of cardiology, a fellowship from Johns Hopkins, and a brother-in-law who sat on the hospital's board of trustees. Rachel Torres was a temp nurse with no degree listed and a suspicious blank space in her work history between 2012 and 2019. This would be easy. Colonel Hendrick's room was on the cardiac care unit, 3rd floor, East Wing. Room 312. His daughter Sarah was visiting, along with 2 family members, a son and an elderly woman who held the blind veteran's hand while he sat in the recliner, his scarred face turned toward the window he couldn't see. Rachel stood by the monitors, her posture perfect, her hands clasped. She had changed the colonel's bedding that morning. The sheet smelled like hospital-grade bleach and something underneath, sweat, fear, the copper tint of a body healing from invisible wounds. Pierce entered without knocking. "Good morning, Colonel. Sarah. Family." Pierce nodded at them with the warmth of a man distributing favors. "Let's take a look at your progress." He stepped directly to the telemetry monitor, where Rachel's shift documentation displayed the vital signs from the past 12 hours. Heart rate readings, blood pressure curves, oxygen saturation trending upward. All normal. All exactly what they should be. Pierce studied the monitor for 3 seconds. Then he turned to Rachel, and his voice became the voice of a man catching someone in the act of theft. "Nurse Torres, can you explain to the family why you documented the Colonel's heart rate at 78 when the telemetry clearly shows 82? His voice wasn't loud. That was the precision of it. It was conversational, almost curious, the kind of tone that made lies sound obvious. "I'm looking at the 5:19 a.m. vitals window right here." Rachel didn't flinch. She glanced at the monitor, then at the chart in her hand. The reading fluctuated during the measurement window, Doctor. The Colonel moved position at 5:28. I documented the average of the stable readings. The average? Pierce repeated this word like a man tasting something poisonous. Interesting. Because in my experience, we document observed facts, not creative interpretations. We don't do mathematics. We do medicine. But perhaps wherever you got your supposed experience, he paused, letting the word hang like a rope, standards were more flexible. The family shifted. Sarah's hand tightened on her father's wheelchair. The elderly woman stopped breathing for a moment. Colonel Hendrick's jaw clenched, his blind eyes fixed forward, and Rachel saw him recognize something in Pierce's tone, the sound of a man using words as weapons, a technique older than medicine itself. Rachel took one measured breath. Her hands remained clasped. One tear escaped her left eye, a single crystal line running down her cheek, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Pierce. When she spoke, her voice was steady in a way that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. "My patients receive accurate, consistent care, Dr. Pierce. And that's what the documentation reflects." Pierce's smile didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He had expected her to crack. He had expected her to apologize, to stumble, to give him the ammunition he needed. Instead, she had answered him like someone answering a question at trial, factual, undeniable, calm in a way that suggested she had stood in difficult rooms before. "Let's continue," he said to his team. "Real nurses need to learn from this." He moved to the next patient, and Rachel remained at the monitors, her tear already drying. But the damage was already done, not to her composure but to Pierce's. He had revealed his intention in front of witnesses. Now he had to follow through. 2 weeks later, the break room campaign. Rachel entered during the lunch shift carrying a brown paper bag with a sandwich she had made at home. The break room was the heart of unit solidarity, where nurses shared stories about difficult shifts, where friendships formed during moments of exhaustion, where someone always offered you their chips if you'd had a bad code. The table was occupied by 6 people, Chen from nights, Martinez from ER rotation, and 3 others, including 2 nurses Rachel had helped during emergencies. She sat down at the empty chair. Conversation stopped like someone had cut the audio feed. It wasn't subtle. It was choreographed silence. Chen looked at Martinez. Martinez looked away. Rachel pulled out her sandwich, unwrapped the plastic with a sound like tearing fabric, and took a bite. The sandwich was turkey and Swiss on wheat bread, made at 5 a.m. in her kitchen while her 14-year-old son slept upstairs. It tasted like ash. One by one, each nurse picked up their lunch container. Each made brief eye contact, a gesture that was supposed to communicate apology but instead communicated obedience. Each gathered their things and left. Within 90 seconds, Rachel sat alone at a table designed for 8 people. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. She set down her sandwich and stared at it. The wall clock ticked. 11:52 a.m. She was back on the floor in 3 minutes. That night, Rachel sat in her kitchen at home with her 14-year-old son Marcus, who was eating cereal and reading something on his phone with the expression of a teenager who understood that adults were failing the world. "You look tired, Mom," he said without looking up. "Just a tough case, baby." She ruffled his hair, a gesture from when he was small enough that she could do it without him immediately pulling away. "Patient recovering slower than expected." Marcus did look up then, and his eyes were the color of a stormy Atlantic, her eyes, from a father he would never meet. "You look like you did after you came back from that place. Afghanistan. When you wouldn't talk about it for 3 weeks. Rachel's hand stilled. She had been a different person then, Captain Rachel Torres, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Special Operations Group. She had been the person who taught combat medics how to function when their hands were shaking and their patients were dying. She had been someone else entirely. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not fine," Marcus said, and he was right with the clarity that children possessed before they learned to lie. "You're scared." She didn't answer. She couldn't. Instead, she kissed the top of his head and told him to finish his homework, and she went to her room and opened her laptop. The faded unit patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment was sewn inside the lining of her jacket, hanging in the closet, a memento, a promise, a reminder of a life that officially didn't exist anymore. She pulled it out sometimes when she was alone, and she did that now, letting the fabric slide between her fingers while she reviewed the files. Colonel Hendrick's labs were the problem. Potassium levels creeping upward, 5.2 on Tuesday the 5th of April, on Thursday the 5th of July, on Saturday. Normal range was 3.5 to 5.0. The fluctuations were inconsistent, spiking without pattern, and they made her scalp tighten with recognition. She had seen this before. Not in person, but in briefings. 3 Bagram veterans had died in the past 18 months at hospitals within a 200-mile radius, all with similar presentations, all with these same irregular potassium spikes, all pronounced dead from sudden cardiac arrest before autopsy could determine the vector. Operation Nightingale had been running for 11 months. The suspicion was targeted poisoning, systematic, methodical, and if true, it meant someone inside the medical system was doing the killing. Rachel photographed chart pages with a phone camera concealed in a Bayer aspirin bottle she kept in the medication room. She uploaded encrypted files to a Pentagon server using the hospital's guest Wi-Fi network at 3:15 a.m., when no one was watching. The upload bar crawled 10%, 40%, 60%, 80%, 100% complete. A voice in her earpiece, barely a whisper, confirmed receipt. That was when Dr. Pierce called her into his office. He didn't schedule it. He simply appeared at the end of her shift and said, "Torres. My office. Now." Not a request. A command dressed as politeness, which was the signature move of men with institutional power. His office smelled like expensive leather and the coffee he had made at 6 a.m. and never finished. There was a framed photo of him at some medical conference, shaking hands with someone important. He sat behind his desk like a judge. Rachel stood. "Your assignment is being changed," he said without preamble. "Effective tomorrow, you'll be rotating to post-surgical recovery. We're rotating you off the cardiac unit." Rachel's composure cracked for exactly 1 microsecond. Her breath caught. "Doctor, I've built rapport with Colonel Hendricks. Continuity of care in cardiac. Are you questioning my clinical judgment?" Pierce's voice became the voice of a man who had never been questioned successfully. "Because I can make this rotation permanent. As in, permanently off this unit. Permanently off my staff. Are we clear?" Rachel took one measured breath. A tear formed but didn't fall. She trapped it behind her lower lid through pure force of will. Her hands were still. Her voice was still. "I'll report to post-surgical tomorrow." "Good." Pierce smiled. "Dismissed." Rachel left his office and walked past Colonel Hendrick's room. The blind veteran turned his head toward the sound of her footsteps, his scarred face moving with recognition. "Torres," he called out, his voice sharp. "That you?" She didn't answer. She didn't enter. She kept walking because she had been trained to keep moving, and also because if she stopped, if she looked at the man who depended on her to keep him alive, she would break protocol in ways that would compromise the mission. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with her laptop, reviewing every lab value, every cardiac reading, every moment of Colonel Hendricks' medical history. The glow from the screen illuminated her face, which looked 10 years older than it had 3 weeks ago. At 2:48 a.m., her phone buzzed. Encrypted message from Pentagon contact, time window narrowing. Need confirmation of vector within 72 hours or we pull you out. Rachel stared at those words. 72 hours. 3 days. And she had just been removed from the patient's care. The game had escalated. She had 72 hours to identify who was poisoning Bagram veterans, gather evidence of crimes that would shake the hospital to its foundation, and do it from a post-surgical rotation where she would never see Colonel Hendricks again. Her hands moved to the unit patch still sitting on the table in front of her. She picked it up, and something in her face changed. The exhaustion was still there, but underneath it, something older woke up, the woman who had operated for 14 hours straight in a combat field hospital, the woman who had held 18 soldiers' hands while deciding who lived and who would be moved to expectant care, the woman who had learned that sometimes the only way forward was through. The exhaustion was still there, but underneath it, something older woke up, the woman who had operated for 14 hours straight in a combat field hospital, the woman who had held 18 soldiers' hands while deciding who lived and who would be moved to expectant care. Rachel set the phone down and stared at her reflection in the darkened computer screen of the break room. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song above her head. 3 days. That was the window Mendez had given her before the Pentagon pulled her out. 72 hours to gather proof that someone inside Seattle General was systematically poisoning Bagram veterans. Colonel Hendricks was next on her rounds. She'd been reassigned to the general cardiac floor, a deliberate move by Dr. Pierce to distance her from Hendricks' primary care team. The notification had come via email at 0630 hours, coldly clinical, unit optimization requires nursing staff redistribution. Effective immediately, Rachel Torres will rotate to floors 3B and 4A. Continued assignment to cardiology intensive monitoring has been deemed redundant given current staffing levels. Redundant. As if she hadn't spent 72 hours learning the rhythm of Hendricks' breathing, the pattern of his questions, the way his sightless eyes tracked sound in the room like sonar. The reassignment was strategic, she understood that immediately. Pierce was cutting her off, removing her from the one patient she'd been assigned to protect. But it had also triggered something in her tactical mind, the same part that had run 7 missions into the Hindu Kush with a surgical kit strapped to her back. If Pierce wanted her away from Hendricks, that meant he knew something. Or suspected something. And that meant the timeline was accelerating. She moved through the hospital corridors at 08 for 7 hours, pushing a vital signs cart that rattled slightly as the wheels hit the tile seams. The smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, mixed with something darker underneath, the metallic copper scent that lingered in rooms where bodies were struggling. Hendricks' room was on the 3rd floor now, the window overlooking the parking lot instead of the gardens. Deliberate. Everything about this was deliberate. The colonel was awake, his head turned toward the door before she entered. That was the thing about blind patients, they heard everything. Every footstep had a signature. Torres? His voice was rough, textured like concrete. Thought you were rotating out. Still doing vitals checks, she said, keeping her tone level, the nurse's mask firmly in place. She approached his bedside, hand steady as surgical steel. How are we feeling today, sir? We? A ghost of a smile crossed his scarred face. You fishing for compliments, or are we in trouble? She didn't answer. Instead, she began the routine blood pressure cuff, the hiss of air as it inflated around his arm. 138/82. 3 points elevated from yesterday. She made a mental note, wrote it on the paper chart clipped to his bed, then continued without breaking rhythm. Pulse, 76 beats per minute, regular. Temperature, 98.4. All normal. But normalcy was the problem now. Because the labs weren't normal. The labs hadn't been normal for 4 days. She'd noticed it on Tuesday morning while pulling his blood work from the electronic system. Potassium levels at 5.2 millimoles per liter. Just slightly above the normal range of 3.5 to 5.0, but present. A whisper of something wrong. By Wednesday, it was 5.6. By Thursday, the 5th of January again. The fluctuation didn't match his clinical presentation, no muscle weakness, no cardiac arrhythmias, no symptoms that should accompany hyperkalemia. Unless someone was adjusting doses, she thought. Unless the elevation was intentional, small enough to avoid immediate alarm but large enough to accumulate. The cardiac markers told a different story altogether. Troponin levels that spiked and fell with no corresponding chest pain episodes. BNP values elevated in a pattern that made no physiological sense. She'd compared them against her hidden reference notes, the ones written in medical shorthand on a folded piece of paper tucked inside her jacket lining, pressed against the same faded unit patch from her last deployment. The patterns matched. Exactly matched the 3 other cases from her encrypted file. The signature of someone who understood cardiac pharmacology well enough to cause subtle damage without triggering immediate intervention. Someone like a cardiologist. "Your cardiac markers are looking good," she said to Hendricks, laying her hand gently on his wrist to check his radial pulse manually, feeling the steady thump of his heart against her fingertips. The sensation grounded her, a living heartbeat, still strong, still fighting. Any chest discomfort? Shortness of breath? Unusual fatigue? No, Hendricks said, and his head tilted slightly toward her voice. Though you sound like you're checking boxes. She was. Because at 0700 hours tomorrow, Dr. Pierce would begin his morning rounds, and by 0800 hours, she would no longer have access to Hendricks' primary care assignments. By tomorrow evening, she would be rotated to floor for A exclusively, monitoring post-op patients with minimal cardiac history. Cut off. Isolated. Useless. The math was simple and brutal. She had less than 30 hours to gather proof that someone was poisoning a blind colonel while a department head with institutional authority actively prevented her from witnessing it. The ticking clock wasn't metaphorical anymore. It was a countdown measured in hours, in heartbeats, in the span between one shift change and the next. She finished her vital signs check and stepped back, pulling the paper chart close. "I'm going to check on your medications with the pharmacy," she said. "Make sure everything is synced with your current condition." Torres, Hendricks said, and his voice had changed, dropped lower, became something harder underneath the courtesy. "You talk like a soldier. You always have." Her breath caught. She didn't move. The moment stretched like a wire pulled tight. "I'm whatever my patients need me to be," she said quietly. "That's so." He turned his head, those sightless eyes somehow still fixed directly on her face, and for a moment she wondered if blindness was a limitation at all. "Because from where I'm sitting, you sound like someone running an operation. And I was running operations before you were born." She didn't respond. Instead, she gathered her documentation, logged the vitals into the electronic system, and noted the medication order discrepancy she'd spotted yesterday. Furosemide dose, updated at 1,430 hours. That wasn't her entry. She pulled up the change log and found it flagged with Pierce's physician ID code. The dose was 20 milligrams more than Hendricks' established order. The comment section read, "Adjusted for observed fluid retention. Closely monitor electrolytes. Reasonable on the surface. Dangerous underneath." She was still staring at the screen when Pierce appeared in the doorway like something summoned by looking at his name too hard. "Torres," he said, and his voice carried the precision of a scalpel. "Your shift in this unit ended an hour ago. You need to clear out." She didn't turn around. She finished logging the medication notation, saved the entry, then closed out of the system. The screen flickered to the hospital logo, a green cross and the words Seattle General, where healing happens. She moved to the bedside and began gathering her vitals cart. "I was just finishing documentation, doctor." Finishing. Pierce stepped into the room, and she could smell the bitter coffee on his breath, the starch of his white coat. You were just leaving. Now. Rachel gathered her things with methodical precision. The blood pressure cuff, coiled like a rope. The thermometer. The pulse oximeter. Everything had its place. Everything had a purpose. She wheeled the cart toward the door, and as she passed Pierce, she stopped. One measured breath. The air in her lungs felt like ice water. If anything happens to this patient, doctor, she said, her voice steady as a stone, I'll make sure the right people know. Pierce's face hardened. The color climbed his neck like he was being strangled from the inside. Is that a threat, Temp Torres? She met his eyes, held them for exactly 3 seconds, and let a single tear escape. She wiped it away deliberately, without breaking his gaze, and something flickered across his face. Uncertainty. Fear. She'd learned long ago that fear and arrogance lived right next to each other in men like Pierce, and sometimes a woman with nothing to lose was the only thing that could distinguish between them. It's a promise, she said. She walked out of the room. Her footsteps echoed in the hallway. Behind her, she heard Hendricks chuckle, a low, satisfied sound, and then Pierce's breathing, sharp and rapid as a wounded animal. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. But she counted the distance from Hendricks' room to the stairwell, 47 feet. She counted the time until her shift officially ended, 58 minutes. She counted the hours until Pierce would have full administrative control over Hendricks' care, approximately 23 hours. What she didn't know was that Pierce had already returned to the computer terminal, was already pulling up Hendricks' file with trembling fingers, was already composing a medication order for the night shift with the clinical detail that made it appear routine. Cardiac glycoside adjustment, he would call it. Monitoring protocol enhancement. The order would be flagged with his physician credentials and submitted at 18:47 hours, just as the evening shift nurse was preparing medication delivery carts. The night nurse, a competent woman named Davies with 15 years of experience, would frown when she read it. The dosage was unusually aggressive for a patient with Hendricks' cardiac history. She would hesitate, finger hovering over the verify button, feeling that small warning bell that every good nurse learns to listen to. But Dr. Pierce was the department head. She would override her concern because that's what institutional power does, it turns doubt into compliance. The medication would be administered at 2,200 hours, intravenous push, direct into Hendricks' central line. By 22:15 hours, his heart rate would begin to climb. By 22:45 hours, the EKG alarm would sound. By 2300 hours, the code blue announcement would crack across the hospital intercom, and everything Rachel had suspected would become violently, irrevocably real. The ticking clock had stopped ticking. It had started counting down. The last shift spiraled into something Rachel had never anticipated. Colonel Hendricks lay in bed 44:12, his blind eyes tracking nothing, his vitals dancing patterns that only she could read. His heart rate climbed. 78. 82. 86. The numbers weren't random. They were a signature. A story written in electrochemistry and malice. Rachel moved through the cardiology floor like a ghost, her movements deliberate, unhurried. She'd learned long ago that panic broadcasts itself like a radio signal. Dr. Pierce had assigned her to Colonel Hendricks for one final shift, a calculated cruelty, a last chance to prove herself before he terminated her assignment entirely. He didn't know this was the shift that mattered. He didn't know she was gathering evidence. She checked his full line at 00 for 5 hours. The fluid was clear. She photographed the label with her phone, hand steady, angling the camera so the timestamp was visible. The potassium levels from this morning's lab sat in her memory like loaded weapons. 2.1 MEq/L dangerously elevated. Not from natural causes. From someone slipping something into his fluids. Into his food. Into the veins that should have been healing him. Rachel pulled up his chart on the clinical workstation, her fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced silence. The previous 12 hours of vital signs formed a pattern that made her jaw tighten. Heart rate acceleration. Blood pressure fluctuations. A mild fever that the day shift had dismissed as post-operative inflammation. She opened her hidden reference document, the one filed under a dead network password that existed only in her encrypted phone, and began cross-referencing the symptoms against the 3 other Bagram veterans who'd been admitted to Seattle General over the past 8 weeks. All 3 had died. All 3 had shown identical patterns. All 3 had been under Dr. Pierce's direct care. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song. Rachel's hands, which had once held a soldier's heart in a palm-sized window carved through his chest at FOB Bagram, now trembled, not from fear, but from the restraint of not moving. Not screaming. Not walking directly into Pierce's office and putting her hands around his throat. She heard her phone vibrate at 0227 hours. Unknown number. She stepped into the stairwell and answered. We need all available staff. Cardiology floor. Now. Code response. The line went dead. Rachel ran. The doors to the cardiology unit burst open under her shoulder. The sound of alarms screamed like wounded animals. Cardiac monitors shrieking their electronic panic. Code blue called over the intercom. Stat stat stat. The hallway was chaos compressed into 40 square feet, nurses moving, crash carts rolling, someone shouting for blood from the blood bank. The code team was already in motion. Rachel didn't think. She moved toward bed 4412. Colonel Hendricks lay unconscious, his chest heaving in the wrong rhythm. The monitor displayed a writhing line, ventricular fibrillation. VFib. The electrical signature of a heart that had forgotten how to beat. The resident was positioning the defibrillator pads, calling out, charging to 200 joules. But Rachel saw something the others had missed. She saw the subtle asymmetry in his chest wall. The way his left side seemed slightly more distended. The tightness around his sternum. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid compressing the heart, strangling it from the inside. A defibrillator wouldn't fix that. Electricity wouldn't drain the poison that was suffocating his own organ. Stop, Rachel said. No one heard her. Stop. Louder. Her voice dropped an octave, the vocal cords of a woman who'd commanded a medical team while artillery landed 400 meters away. The resident looked up. The attending. He needs a pericardiocentesis. Now. We need to wait for Dr. Pierce to. Rachel moved past him like he was a curtain. She grabbed a scalpel from the crash cart, the blade catching the fluorescent light. Her fingers wrapped around it with memory that predated civilian life by 18 years. The metal felt like coming home. She tore open Colonel Hendricks' gown. The code team froze. She positioned her hand at the subxiphoid angle, feeling for the landmarks that muscle memory had burned into her nervous system. Point of the xiphoid process. Move slightly left. Just beneath the ribs. Room for error, 0. The first cut was precise. Clean. The scalpel parted skin like it was air. Blood welled but didn't gush. She knew exactly how deep to go, deep enough to reach the pericardium, not deep enough to lacerate the underlying heart. A field thoracotomy. The procedure she performed 17 times at Bagram when there was no time for surgery, no operating room, just dying soldiers and hands that knew what to do. The resident stepped back. One of them made a sound like a gasp. Rachel's hands moved on their own. Fingers separating tissue planes. Finding the pericardial sac. Opening it. Dark fluid drained from the wound like a confession. Blood that shouldn't have been there. Fluid that had compressed Colonel Hendricks' heart into a fist too small to pump. She wiped blood from his exposed pericardium. Watched the heart expand. Watched it remember how to beat. The monitor changed its song. The wild fibrillation smoothed into a rhythm. Regular. Steady. The electrical signature of a heart that had been given permission to live. 72 beats per minute. 75. 80. Coming up from the grave one beat at a time. We have sinus rhythm, someone whispered. Rachel stepped back. Her hands were trembling now, not from restraint, but from adrenaline that had no more work to do. Blood stained her fingers. The scalpel hung at her side. She was breathing like she'd run 1,000 meters in full kit. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway. His face was white, the color of someone watching a building collapse on his ambitions. Not relief. Not gratitude. Rage. The rage of a man whose narrative had just been obliterated by someone he'd convinced himself was incompetent. She saw the moment his clinical mind pivoted. The moment he stopped processing and started plotting. He turned and walked away. Rachel didn't watch him go. She was already moving toward the attending physician, handing off her findings, her hand still steady enough to document. The resident stared at her like she'd materialized from a different species. One of them whispered something that sounded like "Bagram." She didn't correct him. For hours passed in the slow choreography of hospital procedures. Transfer to the surgical intensive care unit. Imaging to determine if the pericardial fluid was infection or something else entirely. Blood cultures. Toxicology screens. Rachel documented everything with the precision of someone filing an after-action report for a military tribunal. Then the page came. Chief Nursing Officer's office. Immediately. She took the elevator down 2 floors, still in her blood-stained scrubs, her hands unwashed because showing up clean would be an admission of something she wasn't ready to admit. The office was small, administrative, fluorescent lit like a bunker. The chief nursing officer sat behind a desk that suddenly seemed very large. Dr. Pierce occupied a chair positioned like a prosecutor. Hospital legal counsel stood in the corner holding a file thick as a phone book. You performed an unauthorized surgical procedure, the CNO said. Not a question. The patient was in cardiac arrest, Rachel said. You violated hospital policy 7.3.2. Scope of practice. You're a temporary nurse, not a surgeon. Dr. Pierce has filed a formal complaint with the state medical board. The CNO slid a termination letter across the desk. Her eye said she was uncomfortable. Her hand said she had no choice. Rachel read it. The words arranged themselves into the shape of betrayal. Unauthorized procedure. Scope of practice violation. Immediate termination for cause. Ineligible for rehire. He's alive, Rachel said quietly. Yes. And that's the only reason we're not discussing criminal charges. But the hospital can't defend this action. I'm sorry. The CNO looked genuinely pained. You saved his life. I won't forget that. But you also violated every protocol we have. Rachel picked up the termination letter. Signed it. Placed the pen back on the desk with the care of someone placing a flower on a grave. She stood. Thank you for the opportunity. Dr. Pierce made a sound, something between a snort and a laugh. You're done here, Torres. Your little stunt just cost you your career in this state. Rachel looked at him. The fluorescent lights caught the contempt in his expression, the way his fingers drummed against the armrest like he'd just won something. He'd built a career on knowing exactly which protocols to use as weapons. She'd built hers on saving lives in places where protocols were corpses in the sand. She didn't respond. Responding would require using words that would echo in an HR file. Instead, she walked to the door, opened it, and left. The locker room was empty at 0630 hours. She gathered her belongings with methodical precision. Her jacket, the one with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the one she'd kept hidden for 3 months like a secret that could expose her, came off the hook last. She held it for a moment. The weight of 18 years of service compressed into polyester and thread. Then she put it on. The drive home took 40 minutes. She drove in complete silence, her hands gripping the wheel like it might float away. Her mind kept returning to the moment in the OR, if you could call an emergency room an OR, when she'd felt the scalpel part skin. That was when she was most alive. That was when the weight of pretending to be ordinary fell away and she became what she actually was. That was also when her career ended. She sat at the kitchen table at 0700 hours, still in her blood-stained scrubs. Still in her jacket with its hidden military heartbeat. Her hands lay on the surface in front of her like evidence. She put her head down and let the shaking start. Marcus found her at 0900 hours, when he came home from his friend's house where he'd spent the night doing homework. "Mom." His voice cracked. 14 years old and already developing the pitch of a man, but right now just a boy. "Why are you home? What happened?" She couldn't answer. The weight of the lie, that she was just a nurse, just a temp, just a woman without secrets, had finally broken. The lie sat in the room between them like a third person, enormous and undeniable. She shook her head. Marcus stared at his mother frozen at the kitchen table, tears streaming down her face, blood dried on her hands, something in her posture that had finally shattered. He'd never seen her like this. In his entire life, he'd never seen her break. He stood there for a long moment, watching. Then he made a decision. He walked to her bedroom closet. Climbed on the shelf. Reached into the back corner where she thought nothing existed anymore. His hands found the shadow box. He opened it. Dr. Pierce spent for hours in his office building his case with the precision of a man constructing a wall around himself. Complaint filed at 1847 hours. Second complaint at 1923. Third by 2011. Each one thicker than the last, each one citing Hospital Policy 7.3.2 regarding scope of practice violations, each one a brick laid carefully against the one person who had saved a patient's life while he watched from across the room, unable to move, unable to act, unable to be anything except what he was, a cardiologist watching his authority dissolve like sugar in rain. He pulled files on Rachel Torres. 3 months of employment. No formal RN certification. No bachelor's degree. Temp agency placement. The documentation was pristine, a trail so perfectly laid out it could survive any administrative review, any legal inquiry, any audit. He had removed her from Colonel Hendrick's care 6 days ago. She had still found a way to check on him. Now the old man lived, and Pierce's reputation began to crack like ice under pressure. By 1730 hours, Rachel was called to administration on the 4th floor. Not paged. Called. There was a difference. The chief nursing officer sat across from the hospital's HR director and the risk management attorney, faces arranged like judges. They didn't look angry. They looked practiced. Rachel sat without being invited, muscle memory from too many disciplinary briefings in too many command posts. The attorney opened a folder. "Captain," he stopped. Blinked. Started again. "Ms. Torres. Your employment status requires immediate review. Dr. Pierce has filed 17 separate complaints regarding scope of practice violations, unauthorized procedures, and failure to comply with hospital protocols." Rachel didn't speak. She never did at this stage. Let them talk. Let them build their case. Let them think they had won. The folder was slid across the laminate table. "Effective immediately, your contract with the temp agency has been terminated. We have no choice but to accept Dr. Pierce's recommendation. You're being let go." Rachel picked up the folder. Didn't open it. "My patient," the HR director cut her off, "is no longer your concern. You're not licensed to care for anyone in this hospital. You never were." Rachel stood. Slow. Deliberate. The silence in that room was the kind that came before storms. She walked to the door and didn't look back. By 1847 hours, her badge had been deactivated. Her locker cleared. Her name removed from the schedule. She drove home through Raleigh traffic in complete silence, hand steady on the wheel, jaw set like concrete. She found Marcus at the kitchen table 2 hours later, 14 years old and sharp as broken glass, studying her the way Special Forces medics studied trauma patients, cataloging damage. Rachel still wore her scrubs. They were drying now, stained with antiseptic and the ghost of someone else's blood. She was crying. Actually crying. Not the single measured tear she allowed herself in front of enemies, but real tears, the kind that came when there were no witnesses except her son. Marcus watched her for 8 seconds, then stood without speaking. He walked to her bedroom closet. He knew where it was. She had never told him where it was, but he was her son, and sons who grow up watching their mothers disappear into military equipment learn to find what matters. He pulled the shadow box from the back, behind winter coats that never got cold enough for North Carolina. The glass case caught the overhead light. Inside, the bronze star with Valor. The silver star. 2 purple hearts, side by side like matching scars. Marcus came back to the kitchen holding the box like it was made of paper and prayer. He didn't ask permission. He didn't need to. The next morning at 0732 hours, Marcus appeared at Seattle General's main entrance. 14 years old. 5'8". Eyes like his mother's. He walked through the sliding doors with the shadow box held at chest height, and he said it loud enough that people 30 feet away turned their heads. "Mom, they need to see these." The morning shift coordinator stopped filing admissions. A nursing student dropped her coffee cup. The sound of ceramic hitting tile traveled down the hallway like an alarm. Colonel Hendricks heard it from his room on the 3rd floor. His blind eyes, covered by dark glasses even indoors, turned toward the hallway. He listened to the commotion, the footsteps, the shifting of people, and something in his brainstem fired, recognition older than sight, the sound of a unit coming together. He whispered it hoarsely, his voice like a man dragging himself from water. "Reaper 6? That was her call sign from Bagram. That was the medic who had kept his team alive through a mass casualty event that killed 47 soldiers in the first 90 seconds. That was the one they didn't talk about because talking about it meant acknowledging that some people were built differently, that some people had held death in their hands and refused to let it take anything else." A Marine Corps colonel visiting the next bed overheard the name. Heard the recognition in it. He moved into the hallway where Marcus stood with the shadow box, where hospital security had paused, uncertain whether this was a threat or a devotion. The colonel, a man with 32 years of service written in the lines around his eyes, took the citation from Marcus's trembling hands and read it aloud. His voice was the kind that made patients believe they would heal. Captain Rachel Torres. For conspicuous gallantry under fire. Saving 17 lives during a mass casualty event at Bagram Airfield, Kabul province, while under direct enemy fire. He lowered the paper. Looked at the shadow box. Looked at the 14-year-old boy holding it like an offering to gods who might listen. "Son, your mother is a hero. That means the world needs to know what she did." The words hung in the hallway like smoke. Dr. Pierce burst through the crowd at 07 for 9 hours. His white coat was pristine. His credentials were still in his pocket. He had 2 minutes before he found out that wouldn't matter. "Security. I need security. Unauthorized visitors. Hospital policy, section." A 2-star general arriving for a Veterans Affairs inspection turned from the window where he'd been watching the city. He had come to examine conditions for hospitalized veterans. He had been waiting in the lobby when the shadow box emerged. He rendered a sharp salute, fist to chest, the kind of salute reserved for fallen comrades and living legends. He looked directly at Dr. Pierce and his voice was the kind that didn't need to be loud. "Captain Torres's decorations speak louder than your policies, Doctor. That decoration right there. The silver star. That's for Valor under fire. That means she made decisions when seconds mattered. I'm guessing she was right. I'm guessing she's always right." Pierce's face drained like someone had pulled a plug. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "This is ridiculous. This temp nurse, this," the general cut him off with a single sentence that tasted like ice. "She's a combat medical badge holder with 18 months at Bagram. What are your decorations, Doctor?" Within 60 minutes, a Pentagon liaison arrived. Black suit. Clear eyes. The kind of composure that came from managing situations where seconds could end countries. He moved through the hospital with 4 federal agents, escorted by the hospital CEO who suddenly looked smaller than he had been 10 minutes earlier. They found Dr. Pierce in his office, still in his white coat, still believing that institutions protected men like him. The liaison closed the door. Opened a laptop. Operation Nightingale, he said quietly, has been investigating suspected targeting of Bagram veterans for the past 4 months. 3 deaths. All cardiac events. All with irregular lab patterns consistent with potassium chloride injection. 3 families devastated. 1 investigation into a woman who had no business being questioned by anyone except people with stars on their collars. The laptop screen showed charts. Medication orders. Timestamps. Dosages. We needed someone inside to identify the vector. Someone who could access the unit without raising flags. We sent in one of our best. Pierce's hands began to shake. Not from fear. From the realization that he had spent 4 hours building his own case, creating documentation so meticulous that it became a roadmap for federal investigators. Every complaint. Every write-up. Every policy citation was a breadcrumb leading straight to him. The internal review you demanded, the liaison continued, required us to audit all related patient files. Medication orders under your credentials, doctor. Falsified timestamps. Controlled substances diverted in quantities matching the potassium chloride concentrations found in postmortem toxicology. The general stepped forward. His shadow on the wall looked like judgment. 3 counts of negligent homicide. Possibly premeditated. We'll let the prosecutors sort that out. What matters now is that you're going to federal detention pending investigation. Pierce stood. His chair flew backward and hit the wall. I have dedicated my career to this hospital. I was protecting standards. She was a temporary employee with no credentials, no licenses, no, the general's voice was ice water. She held credentials you'll never earn, doctor. She saved your patient when you couldn't. She gathered evidence while you threw tantrums. She did your job better than you ever did, in scrubs, with a scalpel, under conditions that would have broken you in 3 seconds. The door opened. 2 federal agents entered. They didn't cuff him immediately, but the message was clear: you've already lost. Pierce tried to speak. The liaison was already walking out. You can call your attorney from detention, doctor. Rachel watched from the hallway as they led him past. Marcus sat beside her, 14 years old and holding something that looked like pride. Pierce saw her face. For one moment, just one, their eyes locked. Rachel took one measured breath. One tear escaped. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. She said nothing. Pierce looked away first. That was everything. That was the entire story in a single moment. The man who had built his career on breaking people couldn't break her because she had already survived worse. She had held someone's heart in her hands and refused to let it stop. 6 months later, Rachel drove through Raleigh with Marcus in the passenger seat. The suspension on her vehicle was firm, the road smooth beneath them, the city blurring past the windows like a memory losing definition. She wore casual clothes now, not scrubs. But the jacket, the old field jacket with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, that she wore every day. Marcus pointed out the window. Mom, isn't that? Rachel followed his finger. A white medical supply van. A contractor logo painted on the side. Dr. Pierce stood beside it, loading boxes of gauze and syringes, wearing generic scrubs instead of a white coat. No longer a doctor. No longer anyone. His medical license suspended pending criminal trial. His career transformed into medical delivery work, loading supplies that other people would use to actually help patients. He didn't see them. Rachel felt nothing except the quiet recognition that consequences arrive on their own schedule. At Seattle General, she parked in a spot marked Medical Staff, Torres. Colonel Hendricks was waiting in the lobby, no longer a patient but a visitor, accompanied by his daughter. The blind man turned at the sound of her footsteps. Some things didn't require sight. "Reaper 6, he said, offering his hand. Rachel took it firm. "Colonel." Sarah hugged her. "Thank you for saving my dad." Again. The chief nursing officer approached, genuinely smiling now, holding out permanent credentials. "Captain Torres. We're honored to have you." Rachel clipped the badge to her jacket. Marcus stood beside her, taller than 6 months ago, pride written across his face like a tattoo. As they walked toward the elevator, Colonel Hendricks called out one final time. "Torres? Your son did good. Bringing those medals. That took courage." Rachel turned, and for the first time in the entire story, she smiled fully. "He learned it from his CO, sir." The elevator doors closed with a whisper of hydraulics. The doors sealed shut. Behind them, the hospital continued its work, patients healing, veterans remembering, families breathing, the quiet machinery of saving lives grinding forward because somewhere inside these walls, the right person finally had the right authority. If you're watching this, you already know the truth about quiet strength. Subscribe. Like. And tell me in the comments, have you ever underestimated someone and lived to regret it?